2, 1.
Elsewhere on this website you're going to find a very large number of practical resources to enable you to think about and initiate quality improvement projects. This talk is really a high-level approach to the issue of quality improvement with a particular emphasis on the management of change, given that if we're talking about making any kind of improvement in the long term, ultimately we're talking about trying to alter people's behaviours. So we begin with a quote from Martin Luther King, which Barack Obama also picked up on, which was this notion of the fierce urgency of now, and that sense that all the time that we're allowing the current situation to prevail, we are accepting many issues that we would fundamentally much rather be in a position to change. So when we think a bit about quality, we think inevitably about quality failings, especially the modern NHS following the last couple of years, and in particular the Francis 2 report, Sir Bruce Keogh's review of 14 failing trusts, and then more recently the Berwick review, all of which have been a pretty hard-hitting critique of what's going on in the NHS, but which offer very different sorts of approaches to how we might go about making improvements, ranging from, in the case of Francis, a very large number of specific actions that were recommended to be taken. In the case of Keogh, an approach to the review of hospitals involving the triangulation of data, the multidisciplinary review by clinicians in quite a lot of detail of the activities of organisations, and including in that the use of clinicians of all seniorities, including students and junior doctors. And finally the Berwick review, which is probably the shortest of all of them, and which makes a huge emphasis on the need to develop learning organisations and to operate in many ways with a degree of compassion towards staff in trying to understand some of the circumstances that lead to quality failings and offer ways to make improvement. Which inevitably then gets to think about, what about Oxford? Where do we fit in the quality continuum? And in some ways we could say, well, we're doing all right. We were fortunate in many ways to get a rating of good in the CQC inspection recently, a very comprehensive inspection that looked at all 4 hospital sites administered by the OUH and in a lot of detail. And it was no mean achievement to get that rating, and many examples of good practice were quoted, but and if you like, there were 6 compliance actions noted as well, i.e. areas where the trust was deemed as being in breach of the regulations that the CQC oversees. But in addition, not one single area managed to get a rating of outstanding, which is the top rating that's possible with CQC, and that sets out a very clear trajectory for real improvement if we were to achieve our goal of becoming a high reliability organisation, benchmarking with the very best nationally and indeed globally. There are some very straightforward metrics around safety. These are just 2 of the simplest ones, which was that we had no unavoidable MRSA bacteremias in the last year and very low C. difficile diarrhea rates. But there are many other examples of metrics that we track on a very regular basis. It's good at this moment perhaps just to spend a moment or two thinking a bit about what quality failings you might personally have seen. Now, by quality failings, in a sense, what I'm meaning here is anything that one's noticed that feels or looks like a defect in a process, in a pattern of care, in the way that we interact with patients. And once you start to think about those, you realise there are very large numbers of them that we've become rather used to seeing and tolerating at all times. So these aren't always things as grandiose as a prescribing error, important as that is. They may be simply issues like communication really isn't very good, or yesterday so-and-so didn't quite manage to hand over something, or there's a broken bit of kit that nobody seems to get round to mending. And the really interesting thing about focusing on those tiny irritations that are present usually on a multiple basis throughout every working day is that those are exactly the things that tend to add up to larger quality failings as one builds into the next and to the next, the so-called reason Swiss cheese model of patient safety, where multiple independent small factors link up together to produce ultimately a chain of harm. So paying attention to the minor irritating niggles in a sense exposes you to the discomfort of noticing them, but actually is a really important way of finding things to make improvement on. This is in some ways a very simple, completely unlabelled, arguably incomprehensible graph, which shows you a linearly increasing output and then an exponentially increasing one. And we can look at that in a range of ways, for example looking at things like the cost of care, looking at things like the difference between the fixed cash budget the NHS is currently dealing with and the historical rising funding that we were used to before the onset of austerity, and in some ways the yet further increasing levels of cost around high technologies that we're involved in. It demonstrates the kinds of gap that we're constantly looking to have to close by making quality improvement and cost improvement. And in some ways this might also perhaps be a way of just thinking about what our level of ambition and belief is around the kinds of improvement we think we can make. Do we think we can match what many of us would see as an exponentially rising level of expectation among the public around quality? Can we make even linear improvements, or do many of us have the view that actually the best we can do is maintain the current level of quality we've got and we really can't do any better? And you're watching this because many of us here in this organisation believe we can at least do the linear improvement bit, and from time to time, by making really important mobilising changes in behaviour, we may even do better than that. There are a number of strategies at an overall level to think about how quality improvement might be driven. And we can start by imagining the sort of improvement that in an all is for the best kind of world we might hope that individuals would make for themselves. So when I say trust here, I mean trust as in the human quality rather than hospital trusts. But if you simply trust professionals and say, well, they'll sort themselves out, won't they? We'd say people are driven to improve, they can assess what needs to be done, and they will make change for themselves. We can move into areas like professionalism, where there is, if you like, something above and beyond the individual's personal ambition, and as a group of individuals, we have things like self-certification and external certification from a professional point of view. So these areas, if you like, are something to do with individuals' ambition and almost the pride in the work that they do. But that then starts to merge into areas like peer review, which again can be driven from a purely professional basis, or can start to have links into a contracting process. So in a sense, if this bit's about honour and glory and ambition, this bit in the middle is something to do with money, and we can use incentives of various sorts to try to drive people's behaviour. Ultimately, we can start to bring in contracting and regulation that says, if you don't do this, then I will not give you the money. And then ultimately you move into more legal frameworks where you might seek to make change, and that's obviously the way that nationally policy change is used to drive alterations at the front line through changes in legislation, through the enforcement of legislation, and somewhere in the middle we've got areas like litigation. So as individual clinicians, we can have ambition to make change, but we can't really lose track of the fact that we work in a highly regulated environment where ultimately a range of people have a legal power over us as individuals and over the organisation we work in to make changes, including changes around quality improvement. What about straightforward tactics for improvement? What sorts of things might we think of doing? Well, a standard thing would be to say, well, I'll think of something and I'll do an audit. I'll then present the results of the audit to the team that's busy doing the work. Everyone will agree it needs to change, and that will all just sort itself out. And if life was that simple, then we wouldn't probably be having this talk at all. Unfortunately, life's much more complicated than that. People have different ideas about what they want done. Some people like changing, some people don't. So more realistically, what we need to think about is how clearly can you define the need for a change to be made? Management people will talk about burning platforms or melting icebergs, meaning can you demonstrate to the people you think need to make a change that they really cannot stay in the current position? Can you show them how, if change is not made, we will increasingly be in trouble? Data's going to be really important in that, but so is the emotional connection that's made between, if you like, the messenger, the prophet of doom, or the visionary who says it's really time to move, because actually for most people to want to make that move, there's got to be something beyond, yes, these figures look really interesting. So there has to be something that really starts to pull people along and get their energy moving, and you've got to get support in doing that. So there's something about how you articulate that need really meaningfully so that people want to join in. Finally, we then move into, okay, so there's going to be a bunch of people who are likely to respond in a favourable way if I come up with this information. What is it that we're looking to change? So you start to map the current processes and look at the outputs from those. That might be something as straightforward as saying our VTE assessment compliance rate's really poor. What's the process then by which we are actually trying to record that information? How is it that the data turn out not to be good enough? How do we make that better? Ultimately, you end up designing a future state that you can plan and implement as a change. That may sound large and complicated for something that could be quite small, but if we're after enduring change, we have to ultimately be thinking about how we're going to get people to really buy into it and pull it along, which is why you end up needing to measure the progress, review the plans, continue to redesign in this continuous process that we'll come back to in a minute, the PDSA type process. So if we bring that down to what sorts of things can people actually do as individuals, how would you go about this? Well, you're unlikely to get very excited and put lots of energy into something that doesn't somehow inspire you. So you'll have spotted something, be curious about it, think a bit more about it, what's that mean? Can you get really excited about it? Can you take ownership of sorting that out? Maybe you've decided that the pattern of sleep in patients on the ward is terrible. I've seen a group of junior doctors who got interested in that. Maybe you get really excited about lack of healthy food on the wards. I've seen doctors get excited about that. So the more, in a sense, you can personally own something, the more chance there is that you're going to be able to see it through when it gets tricky. Atul Gawande talks about the need to count something, and if we're talking about quality improvement, but counting against a standard is the ideal way to do that. You've then got to report the outcome to the colleagues. Is a change needed or not? To some extent that will depend on how far away it is against a standard other people are either willing to accept voluntarily or that indeed is being imposed from elsewhere. So we think about the 4-hour wait in the emergency department, that's an imposed change from elsewhere that was designed to meet a perceived need for quality in the bulk of patients attending, who wants to be stuck there for more than 4 hours, but actually meeting that target is hard work. And then we're back again to talking it through with the other people in the team, getting that plan of action to make the improvement. You've then got to start going and keep at it. It is much easier to make small changes that are in your own control than it is to come up with some grand plan. It's much easier for me to decide I'm going to come up with an improvement plan for my administration process than for me to decide I want to build a whole new building somewhere. So when we think about this cycle of change, there's the plan, do, study, act cycle, and there'll be much more information about that elsewhere, but the PDSA is about that process of what am I going to do? I'm going to do it, I'm going to measure what I've done, I'm going to have a think about that and work out how to make further changes. And the notion of that is that's a continuously spinning cycle that then drives you off up the improvement mountain, as it were. So in this hospital, there are large numbers of areas that need lots of work still. Consistency of existing processes to remove variation. Variation in standard processes is a key driver of poor quality. High reliability organisations are very good at delivering consistency in the way that they treat patients. So all of these things individually needs to be done. If all of those are at 90%, you might say that's pretty good. But if no one patient gets all of those things and they're meant to have all of them, then you've got 0% in terms of the total bundle of quality effort that you want to make. So consistency is really important. There are plenty of things, however, that do need to be redesigned as well. Areas like clinical handover, there's a lot of work going on now. The endorsement of results that now come back into the electronic patient record, and the adoption of the electronic patient record in the longer term. And communication, we know, is at the heart of what we do on a day-to-day basis. It's critical both between teams, but also to patients and their families. Do they know their treatment plan? Do they know their discharge plan? Are they signed up to that? And the audits and the work that we've done on an informal basis through the peer review processes demonstrate really that large numbers of patients on a day-to-day basis do not know these things. So I'll just give you one small piece of history just to remind you about some of the difficulty of this and why sometimes it can be tricky. Lieutenant William Sims was from the US Navy and was seconded to the British Navy around 1900 and met Admiral Percy Scott. Now the context of this rather interesting story is that just around the turn of the 19th century, in the Spanish-American War, naval ships fired 9,500 shots and 121 of them hit the target. And that's because there was no automatic levelling system for the guns on the boats, and so the guns simply moved as the boats rocked backwards and forwards in the waves, and so hitting the target was an extraordinarily difficult thing to achieve. It also required the boats to be rather close together. Scott had invented a new mechanism for automatic levelling the guns, and Sims immediately saw the potential for it. He went away and developed it and ended up with guns that had 3,000% more accuracy than the historical ones, and he reported the innovation to his superiors. And this is where the story gets really interesting, because it took him years and an extraordinary level of determination to escalate this beyond every successive level in the US Navy, until ultimately he managed to get, by then, a very, very large dossier of more and more and more evidence that he generated in this rather zealous fashion onto the desk of the president, who immediately realised that this needed to be sorted out and ordered it was done. Now, why had that not happened quickly when it was an obvious thing to do? And the general view was that the issue was that by inventing a gun that allowed much more accuracy and that allowed boats to be much further away from each other, I think ships is probably the right word for naval people, but allowed them to be further apart, actually the heroic qualities of the captain in manoeuvring one ship very close to the enemy to be able to fire at them without getting sunk yourself was massively diminished. Instead, all of the power, if you like, and the expertise was now shifting to the people who were the gun aimers and the navigators, and weren't really with the captain at all, at least against the old model of what being a naval captain was about. And it was felt that it was this that made it impossible for the naval hierarchy to see why this would be a good thing, because it completely challenged their thought processes about what was important about being an officer in the Navy. So it was adopted eventually, and I think what the story shows us is that good ideas and innovations and change will not always automatically happen if you can't win these arguments with individuals and accommodate their belief system. And to some extent that's part of this well-known graphic around the adoption of innovation, which would suggest that only a very small percentage of people are genuinely really up for making change lots of the time, that there's another whole group who will come on board once they start to see it, and then there's this sort of early majority, but there's a huge raft of people who will be slow to come on board, and some who will take a very, very long time. In fact, some people may lag so far behind that they're behind even this innovation when it's embedded behaviour, let alone the next one you want to bring in. Further analyses, if you like, theoretical analyses of the kinds of groups you might find are quite entertaining to look at. If you plot, in this case, people who've got varying levels of energy to pursue their own agenda versus varying levels of resistance to what the organisation wants to do, you can come up with groups. Now, these are not very charitably named, so they're more for, and I didn't invent any of this stuff. So the suggestion is there is a group of people in the organisation who really are not particularly pushing to do their own thing, and they won't really resist what the organisation does. There are some people who have slightly more energy to resist the organisation but aren't really doing anything for themselves. They'll sort of moan a bit. There are some who will actively oppose but still aren't really coming up with anything for themselves. And then there are a group, if you like, who will actively resist you rather than just oppose. They'll go out and really try and undermine the change you're trying to bring in. And then, on the other hand, you've got some people who will come on board, in some cases very quickly, with what the organisation wants, so no resistance there, and put lots of their own energy into it. There's a very interesting group who will put in quite a lot of their own energies, but are slightly less sure, if you like, about coming on board with the organisation. And then there's this very large group who are really sort of wavering between doing their thing and doing the organisation's thing. And then ultimately you've got some people who have high levels of energy for doing their own thing and do not want to do what the organisation wants at all. Now, this of course is a chart that's put together entirely from the perspective of the manager who wants to make the change. You could completely alter this around and say these people are crazy idiots who want to make changes that have not got an evidence base, and the people over there are the ones who are really leading it. But it's really just a way of thinking about the different kinds of personality that exist in a group. And one really important thing to understand is that the people who are going to help you make the biggest change are this group. They're the ones who aren't necessarily the early converts, because lots of other people are watching what they're going to do. Whereas the people who are out there carrying the torch miles ahead, saying, come on, this is fantastic, tend not to have such strong connections with a larger group of people in the organisation. So they'll be important for this group, but this is the group to really concentrate on bringing on board. Okay, so what does that mean altogether in terms of the skill set that you might need if you're trying to help these changes come in? The first thing is you've got to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. So you have to get to the point where you know change has got to happen, you are owning the thing that needs to change, and you know that the current situation is not okay. And that's a very different place to be to the one where you have said, I'm not going to think about all these awkward, difficult things, I'm just going to get on with what I do, because actually that second position is a way to some extent of not having to think about things that are otherwise going to make you nervous, frankly. So you've got to be quite brave in that sense around taking potentially people on, but you've got to do that skillfully. There's no point in aggravating all the people who ultimately you're going to try and persuade. And there's something about inspiring yourself and them to make those changes. And then, as elsewhere in this website, you're going to have to learn these basic principles for making improvements, how you manage improvement, how you manage change. Finally, there is something about just being slightly aware about all those sort of other forces that we never really talk about, but that are all lurking out there, particularly in a complex organisation delivering healthcare. So if the top of the iceberg is the bit that we think we see, the processes, the behaviours, all the straightforward stuff, do we really know all the things that are driving the behaviours of our patients, our staff, our leaders, and in some cases ourselves? And sometimes we don't spend a lot of time thinking about that. That's probably all right. But now and again, just remember that there's quite a lot happening underneath the surface in complex organisations is worth remembering. These little quotes from Russ Aikoff, who is a systems thinker and came up with a lovely set of books, one of which is called Management F-Laws, and they're full of entertaining little one-liners, really. Difficult for those inside a box to think out of it, so we're always saying we must all think outside the box. Actually, it's quite difficult because we're in it. The only thing more difficult than starting something new is stopping something old. And indeed that's probably true, that actually getting people to stop doing something is quite hard, and you need to think about that when you're bringing in an innovation. This idea, the level of conformity in an organisation is in inverse proportion to its creativity. So that's a really interesting balance. We're constantly wrestling with the tension between let's do something new and exciting and hang on a minute, let's just get the processes sort of fairly standard. I've talked already about variation and the problems with that. And then this one that's rather amusing. In an organisation that disapproves of mistakes but identifies only errors of commission, then the best strategy for anyone who seeks job security is to do nothing. So these are not entirely serious, but they're just good ways to sort of challenge your thinking a little bit. There's some very nice bits of reading. I've focused here on reading around leadership and change. If you read only one person out of any of these, I'd probably go to Atul Gawande. As a doctor who was involved in the WHO checklist, and the checklist manifesto is a very good account of that. But actually, as a thinking doctor, his books Better and Complications have got some really provocative essays in there. But there's a huge literature on this, and I know there's going to be a lot more resource around the specific change management issues as well. Thank you. Done right?